Okay, thanks very much, and thanks for inviting me to this wonderful conference. I thought I would talk a little bit today about a paper that I'm working on jointly with Artie Singh, University of Sydney. These are actually notes for a paper. Some of you know a paper that preceded this, which had two other co-authors on it, Kostas Zariadis and Jacek Suda, but you can't blame them for this, so it's just me and Artie on this. This is a story. I'm going to tell a story, and it's going to fit with the theme of the conference, as you'll see here. This slide's kind of boring, so I think we should just go through this one. You guys got to wake up here. This is an academic talk. In the model presented here, monetary policy is going to have an important role to play, but not because of the sticky prices. So throw out your sticky price models out of your head. Households are going to supply labor endogenously, and household labor supply will differ across households. That's why heterogeneous labor supply is in the title of this. Nevertheless, monetary policymakers will be able to carry out an optimal monetary policy without reference to household labor supply. So I see this as helping to inform the debate on whether U.S. monetary policy needs to worry about declining labor force participation or not, which has been a hot issue in the United States and which definitely links to the themes of this conference. And the bottom line of this talk is that the answer to that is no. Monetary policy would not have to take into account in this model declining labor force participation. So let's see what I'm up to here. U.S. labor force participation has been depressed since the big recession, and portions of the U.S. monetary policy discussion have been focused on the idea that we somehow have to re-energize labor force participation or revive labor force participation to higher levels through monetary policy. So if I have a message here, it's going to be, I don't think monetary policy can do this, so this is why we talk about structural reforms. They're coming from somewhere else other than monetary policy. So the key questions you would ask about this are, can monetary policy substantially affect labor force participation? And even if it can, should it? And in this presentation, I'm going to think of labor force participation and household labor supply, and I'm going to use those phrases interchangeably. This shows that I'm a macro guy and not a labor guy. So if you wanted to get more detail into this, I think you could. I think you could work out actual labor force participation rates, but I don't think the main message would change. So we're just thinking about household labor supply here. And there are really two views on this. One comes from the Aronson et al. Paper in Brookings in 2006. They built a demographically based labor force participation model and successfully predicted the post-crisis 2013 labor force participation rate. I'll show you a picture of that in just a minute. So you could take from that paper and its subsequent updates the idea, in quotes here, which is just different demographic groups tend to have different labor force participation rates, more or less independently of the business cycle, independently of monetary policy, independently of real interest rates. And that is indeed what's going to happen in the model that I'm going to show you. The alternative view, the fourth bullet point here, is Ersig and Levin. Andy Levin is in the audience here, and a nice paper in the JMCB argued that a large portion of the post-crisis fall in labor force participation is cyclical. So that's not going to happen in the paper or in the results I show you here. So here's the Aronson et al. View. This picture goes back to 1991. Labor force participation is the dark blue line. They wrote their paper in 2006. That's the dotted red line. And then they predicted forward based on a basically demographically based model almost entirely. And they predicted that labor force participation would decline, and indeed, actual labor force participation landed right on top. So this never happens in macroeconomics. You never get a prediction that accurate. So I was very impressed by this paper. Now, if you take a longer look at labor force participation in the US, this goes back to 1960, and you just fit the Hodrick-Prescott filter to this, and then you look at the correlation between the Hodrick-Prescott trend and the actual data, you'll get about a 1 or 0.99. So that kind of suggests everything is trend. Everything is trend. Here's the Ersig and Levin view. This is figure 1 out of their paper. Again, this is the same data. The labor force participation rate is the dark line there, going back from 2004, 2005. It fell off dramatically in 2007, 2009, and subsequently they compare that to the Congressional Budget Office or the Bureau of Labor Statistics projections and argue that this must have been a cyclical factor, and then they build a model around that. So this is the alternative view, and for that you have to go to their paper. But I'm going to be more consistent with the traditional view and argue that the traditional view is more nearly correct. So the model economy here will include heterogeneous households. They will supply different amounts of labor at every date. Monetary policy will be conducted optimally to repair friction in household credit markets, and the optimal monetary policy can be conducted independently of household labor supply decisions. So demographic factors, and in particular baby booms or time-varying population growth, will affect the measured supply of aggregate labor supply of households, really. So let's get on with it and talk a little bit about the friction. I said we weren't going to do sticky prices here. We're going to have a credit market friction instead. And why would you want to do that? Well, the 2007 to 2009 crisis returned attention to credit markets. A lot of our models don't even have credit markets. Could monetary policy be used to keep the household credit markets working well? This is really the motivation for going to this friction as opposed to the sticky price friction. We're going to study an economy with a large private credit market that's essential to good macroeconomic performance. That is, if this market did not exist, some people would not be able to consume. This market has an important friction, which is going to be non-state contingent nominal contracting, and I'll talk about that throughout these slides. The role of monetary policy will be to keep this credit market functioning properly. When the credit market breaks down, bad things happen in the economy. So this is a complete markets story where we want the credit markets to be complete. And then indeed, when a large and persistent negative shock hits the economy will encounter the zero lower bound. But get this, monetary authority will be able to handle that situation too, and continue to complete markets even in that situation. So I may not get all the way to the zero bound part of this talk, but that's also an interesting feature. There are no approximations here. There's no linearization here or anything like that. This is a global result. There's a lot of income and wealth inequality in this model, and I'm not going to have time to talk about it, but I'll point it out as we go along. The role of the credit markets is to reallocate uneven life cycle income into perfectly equal consumption. We'll see how that works. The model will naturally rank financial wealth Gini as the highest, income Gini as the second highest, and consumption Gini as the lowest. This is an advertising slide to convince you that this is an important friction. How big are these markets? According to Mian and Sufi, they're anywhere from 1.15 GDP to 1.65 GDP before the crisis. So you're talking about anywhere from 20 to 25 trillion dollars. That's trillion with a T. And if these markets are screwed up, that would suggest that that would be a big macroeconomic problem. A lot of that is mortgage debt. A huge fraction of it is mortgage debt. What is mortgage debt? It is people earlier in the life cycle trying to pull housing services forward in the life cycle. So I think this is the right model to think about household credit markets. Okay, so let's just take a look at what we actually do. This is a simple and stylized endowment dynamic stochastic general equilibrium T periods life cycle model of private debt. An important component of this is that the debt that's floating around here as I talk is privately issued debt. There is no government debt in this model. There's actually not much of a government at all except for a monetary authority. You could add all that in and talk about it, but this is really, you should think about mortgage-backed securities is really the debt in this model. There's going to be two parts to this. There's going to be a very large credit sector and a small cash sector. And the friction is going to be non-state contingent nominal contracting. There is going to be uncertainty in this model. Labor productivity growth is variable, and that's the only source of uncertainty. What monetary policy can do is substitute for the missing state contingent contracts and actually completely repair the friction in this model. And in certain situations, the zero lower bound is going to threaten to bind, but you can still complete credit markets in that situation. And then we do have the labor supply decision here, but that's going to be independent of monetary policy choices. So all this can go on, and the policymaker can conduct optimal monetary policy, but independent of what the labor supply is doing. So the monetary policy implications are that in normal times, optimal policy will look like nominal GDP targeting, which is really countercyclical price movements. So, that's one bottom line to take away here. And then how do you handle the zero lower bound? What you should do when you counter the zero lower bound is threatening is you should create a one-time increase in the price level. So what you want to do in this model is you do not want to be at zero nominal interest rates. You do not want to be pinned down to zero nominal interest rates. You want to stay off the zero bound because that's the only way you're going to be able to continue to complete credit markets. There's no role for forward guidance. Staying at the zero lower bound would actually be bad policy in this model because you'd have incomplete household credit markets in that situation. Again, the household labor supply will be driven by non-monetary factors. So I think these results might help inform the debate in a low nominal interest rate environment. They might help inform the debate for this conference where there's a lot of talk about structural reforms, but we'll see how much talk about using monetary policy to try to fix issues in labor markets. Okay, so I'm not going to have a lot of time here to go in a lot of detail, but I'll sketch some of the things about the actual modeling environment so you just get the hang a little bit of what we're up to here. So this is a T-period life cycle endowment economy. There's no capital. As in the new Keynesian model, there's no capital there either in the standard versions. And you can choose any T that you like. I kind of get hassled about the T-period overlapping generations model, so choose your favorite T. It's got to be 3. It's preferably an odd number, but any T will do. If you want to go to infinity, you can work in continuous time as well. I like T equals 241. That would make this interpretable as a quarterly model. All the interest rates would be quarterly. All growth rates and so on will be quarterly. I think that's the easiest way to interpret it, and the pictures I show will have T equal to 241. There are going to be 2 types of households, participants in the credit markets and non-participants. And I want you to think of the participants as the vast middle class. These are life cycle people. They earn more income in the middle of life. They want to borrow earlier in life. They want to take out mortgages and so on. There will be another sector, which is the cash sector of the economy. These people will be very different and have different productivity endowments. And I want you to think of those guys as the unbanked in the U.S. And we'll talk about them a little bit more later. Estimates put the unbanked in the U.S. at anywhere from 10 to 15% of the population. They only use cash. They do not access credit markets. So there's 2 assets in the model, the privately issued debt, or consumption loans and currency. Participants could hold either asset, but in the stationary equilibrium we study, they're not going to want to hold the currency as it will be dominated in rate of return. The non-participants can't hold the better asset, so they can only hold currency. And then here's some preferences, and I just want to point out a little bit here about the preferences. This is consumption, this is leisure, and here's the weight on consumption, here's the weight on leisure. I'm going to show you a lot of pictures here where the weight is eta equals 1, so that would be, it's just log consumption. But I'll show you one picture where eta equals 0.5, and that'll show you what happens to labor supply, and then we'll talk about that picture. But nothing really changes in a qualitative sense when you go from eta equals 1 to eta equals 0.5. There are a lot of other assumptions underlying here you might be wondering about. There's no population growth in this version. There's no capital. There's no default. People are repaying their loans. There's a flexible price model. No borrowing constraints. You can borrow as much as you want. And this is the key friction in the model. Loans are dispersed and repaid in the unit of account. and are not contingent on income realizations. So if you're not used to working with this friction, there are two parts to it. The fact that it's not state contingent is causing a real misallocation of resources. The fact that it's nominal means that the central bank might be able to come in and fix it. So there are really two parts to this. Here's a stochastic structure. The real wage, W, grows at gross rate lambda. This is just a fancy way, equation 2 is a fancy way of saying lambda is an AR1 process. But I'll just point out that there is a mean growth rate in this economy, this unadorned lambda there. And rho indicates the degree of serial correlation, and sigma indicates the scale parameter. And eta is a normal 0, 1. So you could have as big a shock as you want in this economy. Everything will work fine. And in fact, you could use more complicated stochastic structures. But the main point to take away from this is a growing economy. It will grow at rate lambda on average over time. So timing protocol is critical to how these things work. Nature moves first and chooses a shock. Policymaker gets to observe the shock and move second, and that's why policy is going to work in this model. Households will then decide how much to consume and save. And then the way this works is everyone comes into the model at age 20, and you're handed a life cycle productivity profile. And it looks like this, and I just want you to think of this as, so here's our 241 periods. So you come in at age 20, let's say you're gonna live 241 periods. And in the beginning of life over here, you have almost no ability to earn income from market work because you have very few productivity units. You can sell these productivity units at the competitive wage on the market, so you're going to earn a lot more income at middle age here and a lot less income as you get closer to the end of life. So we've made this exactly symmetric. It exactly peaks at exactly the middle period of life, and this makes our world very simple and helps us to be able to solve things with pencil and paper. This is also a point in time labor income distribution for this economy, because you can take this productivity profile and within elastic labor supply, all these units would be supplied, and you just multiply this curve by W and you get the labor income in the economy at a point in time. So labor income's very uneven at a point in time. Middle income, people who are in their peak earning years are earning lots, and people who are near the beginning or end of the life cycle aren't earning very much. And if the economy grows 10%, then you just multiply by a higher W, and so income goes up like this in this economy. So again, it is a growing economy over time, and income is increasing over time. For money and nominal interest rates, we have non-participant households. These guys can't use the credit markets. They're inactive in the first period of life. They're then endowed with a small amount of productivity in odd periods of life, and they want to consume in the even periods of life, and they have to use cash. That's their only asset. So there's no life cycle aspect to these guys. What they do is they just work every other period during life. When they work, they get paid. They have to take their pay in cash. They hold the cash to the next period when they purchase consumption from the other group that is on the other side of this transaction. So they're going to work only intermittently and save all income by holding currency. So the upshot of that is that creates a money demand in the model. The central bank can supply currency to this group, and they can completely control the price level through this process. So I think the basic thing to take away from this is the way we've set this up, the central bank completely controls the price level, and obviously you could relax that more. For theory types in here, this last bullet point's important. Seniorage revenue is rebated lump sum to even-dated cash users. That means that what will happen is that the policy that we're talking about will actually be first best, both for the cash users and for the credit households in this economy. Then back to the credit markets then, okay, you've got this nominal contracting friction, so lenders and borrowers have to decide what nominal interest rate they're going to contract on. That's going to be given from a first order condition right here, which says the inverse of the nominal interest rate is this expectation on the right, which depends on consumption growth and what the policymaker is going to do with the price level. So this is what we call the contract rate. And then what is the central bank doing? The policy that we're talking about here is actually going to be first best, but you can think of the policymaker as being very worried about this huge credit market. There's a huge, huge credit market. First and foremost, you want this credit market to be working perfectly. And then, if you can, you'd also like to hit an inflation target because maybe you're worried about the cash users in this economy. We're going to assume an inflation target of 0 for convenience. Policymakers are going to be able to do first best here. We're only going to look at stationary equilibria. There's no transition. So I'm just going to look at a non-stochastic balanced growth path, and you can get almost all the intuition from this. Then we're going to go to the stochastic economy, but it's going to be obvious at that point what happens. So here's what happens along the non-stochastic balanced growth path. Again, here's your 241 guys who are alive at a point in time, and here's their net asset position. This guy, so almost all the financial wealth is held by 50% of the households, and that's concentrated among those who are at 65 years old. The maximum indebted guys would be about 35 years old. This is drawn for 8 equals 1, so there's consumption only in the utility function, but we can, it wouldn't change appreciably. And then if we had 8 equal to 0.5. Here's the change in net asset holding if the wage goes up over time, which it does in this economy. And so I think the point of this picture is to say, gee, Jim, this is a heterogeneous agent economy with an aggregate shock. How are we going to solve this with pencil and paper? The answer is you do need to know the distribution, but it's very clear what the distribution here because you're just multiplying this curve by W. And then here's the main thing that happens in this model is that this is labor income at a point in time, which is hump-shaped. But the credit market means that consumption, if the credit market is working perfectly, consumption will be perfectly flat across all cohorts. So what is this saying? And this is drawn for 8 equals 1 as well. The private credit market completely solves the income inequality problem in this model. The private credit market completely solves the income inequality problem. So everyone in this economy, in the credit sector of this economy, has an equity share in the output produced in the credit sector, and they get to consume their share, even though some of them are earning very little and have very little productivity, and others are earning a lot and have a lot of productivity. And then this is a growing economy, so this grows over time, so income would go up over time, and consumption would indeed go up over time, but it would be, again, in the next period, it would be again split between all the people that are alive in that period. And here's the household labor supply picture that I wanted to show you. So this is drawn for 80 equals 0.5. This keeps everything interior. This hump-shaped curve is the labor supply curve for the different cohorts who are alive at date T. The inverse shape, U-shape, is the complement of this, which is the leisure of these guys. So middle-aged guys like me are working like dogs. We're at the peak of the curve here, and people at the beginning and end of the life cycle are only working a relatively small fraction of their available hours, maybe only 10% or something like that. For these cohorts are 60 or 65%. So there's huge differences in labor supply by cohort. But the point of this is independent of what the wage is, what the growth rate is, what the real interest rate is. This is just heterogeneity by age. If you ran a population growth rate through this, a varying population growth rate, and you had more guys over here, then you'd get lower household labor supply. So what are the main implications of this? Hours worked and population growth should be highly correlated. An economy with more older workers would have a lower aggregate labor supply, a similar economy with an even age distribution. So just for kicks, I put the total US hours on a same chart with civilian non-institutional population since 1948. Correlation here is 0.99. So that part of the prediction seems to be borne out. In this economy, a really key thing, the reason it's all stylized here is we get this result. The real interest rate, the gross real interest rate, is equal to the output growth rate all the time. Let's go to the stochastic economy. I'll finish up here. What happens in the stochastic economy is that if there was no friction, then the real interest rate would equal the stochastic growth rate at every point in time. So you get this kind of thing. That's if there's no friction. If there is a friction, then you've got to somehow get back to this allocation of resources. But lo and behold, the policymaker can do that by following this policy rule right here. So there's kind of a Taylor rule here. The price level should be adjusted from the past according to the difference between what the expected growth rate was and what the realized, this is realized, what the realized growth rate was between the two periods. So this is very similar to a good paper by Sheedy and Brookings. Also Evan Koenig has this same kind of thing. And then even in the stochastic economy, what will happen is households will again consume equal amounts of available production in the credit sector. So here's another version of this if you want it in pi and y terms. Here's the inflation rate. Here's your inflation target. Here's the expected growth rate last period. Here's what actually happened. This is nominal GDP targeting. All right, zero lower bound. I don't have time to talk with that, so I'm going to finish up here. Basically, when you hit the zero bound, you should create a one-time increase in the price level. That will keep you away from the zero bound, so you would not want to be at the zero bound in this economy. So the desire behind many actual policy choices over the past several years has been to help credit markets somehow. Our low interest rate policy at the Fed has been touted in our rhetoric as helping credit markets. And this paper actually has a credit market, and it's essential to good macro performance. And it has a friction, which is non-state contingent nominal contracting. This paper suggests a method of conducting monetary policy when the zero lower bound threatens, which is to credibly promise a one-time increase in the price level. The bottom line here is that one would not want to keep policy rates at zero, but would want to keep nominal interest rates positive, in stark contrast to common policy recommendations in recent years. A lot of the common policy recommendations have been forward guidance, meaning once you hit the zero bound, you should promise to stay at the zero bound even longer, or quantitative easing, which has been justified as pushing term premiums down and moving longer term interest rates lower. Those would be not the right kind of policy responses for this particular friction that we've explored in this paper. And household labor supply is heterogeneous, but independent of monetary policy choices consistent with the traditional demographically based view of labor force participation. So I think this might help inform the debate during this conference as we think about the interactions between monetary policy and the types of structural reforms that so many countries need. So I appreciate your attention and suffering through with me on this, and I hope we get a chance to talk about this more as I will be around the remainder of the day here and into the evening. So thanks a lot.